Thank you. Thank you, Philip. My name is, good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. My name is Richard Dent. I'm your MC for today. I was reflecting on the acknowledgement we often give, we usually give at the start of our meetings, and I was reflecting that we often acknowledge the lands upon which we're meeting. And then I look out here and I see what we now call Port Phillip, and I reflect that, in fact, perhaps we should be acknowledging lands and waters, what we now call the Yarra River, what we now call Port Phillip. And in particular, acknowledge that in oral history of the Wurundjeri people, they remember through the oral history that, in fact, Port Phillip used to be verdant bushland and was only flooded about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. It seems great to me that that story continues to the present day. So we acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, their elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Thanks today will be given by Philip Cornish, followed by the Loyal Toast, presented by President Reg. Please ensure as we sit down that your glasses are charged. We're looking forward to a wonderful meeting, and I'd like to welcome Philip, please.
When I was a youngster, I remember asking my father, when did modern history begin? I was astonished when he told me the Battle of Waterloo. I knew he was wrong. It does feel like something significant is happening in the world at the moment. Perhaps future historians will view this as the beginning of a new period. And if that is the case, we will need peacemakers. I was reminded about Rotary's contribution to peace when I listened to an online talk by an American, in part about what is happening in Ukraine. He started the speech in Russian. Why? Because he had been a Rotary exchange student to Russia, and it taught him not to see an enemy, but potential friends. I think somewhere we have a peace fellow here today as well. I'd like to give thanks for the small contributions and the large that Rotary makes to building peace and friendship around the world.
Rotarians and guests, a toast to Australia and Rotary International. Thank you, everyone. Please be seated. We'll shortly be breaking for lunch, and those online will be ushered into a breakout room where they can enjoy some fellowship or perhaps take their own break for a meal. We will reconvene at about 1:10 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy. It's great to have you here. Thanks very much, Russell, and everyone, members, visitors and guests. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our 33rd meeting of the year, of this Rotary year, and our 4,929th meeting as a club in our 101st year. It's wonderful to see everyone here today, and I've got to say it's a constant joy to feel the energy when we have our people-to-people meetings. Our guest speaker today is Emma Germano. Emma will be speaking on a whole range of things that might start with a little bit about the impact of the pandemic, but I can assure you we'll probably go a lot further than that. So welcome, Emma. And Emma is going to be introduced by Chair of the Day and renowned peony farmer, Bernie McIntosh, later in the program. In the meantime, please acknowledge and make both welcome. Also, as a guest of the club today, we have Rotarian Ken Badenock. We'll hear from Ken shortly, as he is honoured and named as a Paul Harris Fellow by the club today. Ken is accompanied by his eldest daughter, Rebecca, and you'll hear more of that when we get to the presentation. Also, as a guest of the club today, we have, hosted by Bob Fells from our Rotary Foundation Committee, we have Peace Fellow candidate Sebastian Antoine. Please join me in welcoming and making these guests all welcome. We have a couple of other visitors, and I'd like to welcome Sapdi, who is a guest of Dasun Premadasa, sorry. And I think that you're the only other visitor. Welcome, thank you. Okay, I think we might move straight to the Paul Harris Fellow presentation to Ken. And just before I call you to the podium, Ken, the Paul Harris Fellow Award is named for Paul Harris, who founded Rotary with 3 business associates in Chicago in 1905 and was established in his honour in 1957 to support humanitarian and educational programs through the Rotary Foundation. And that foundation is implemented and managed by Rotarians and Rotary clubs around the globe. A donation of $1,000 US is made in the name of the recipient. It's the tradition of this club that the naming of a Paul Harris Fellow is based upon the contribution of individual members and deserving members of the community who have demonstrated by their actions the Rotary motto of service above self. Today, we recognise Ken Badenock. Ken, you're at the podium, welcome, and for your sustained commitment to the service above self, for service above self to the club and the community we serve. It gives me great pleasure to present on behalf of the board and members of Rotary Melbourne your Paul Harris Fellow pin and citation, which I'll just lean over it. This is the pin and the citation. Ken, would you come to the podium? I'll look after this for you. Thank you. And tell us a little bit in response. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, President Reg. I'm not quite sure where to start, so probably at the beginning would be a good place to begin. Several hundred years ago, when I joined the Rotary Club of Melbourne, I was absolutely overwhelmed by the number of committees that there were within the club. So foolishly, I joined several of them. And that obviously wasn't going to work very well for some time. So I gradually refined that down to the Welfare of the Young Committee, of which I've been a member ever since. And I was completely taken by the fantastic work that the Welfare of the Young Committee managed to do. And not only just the things that we ourselves did, but managing all those other programs on behalf of the club. And that was going along swimmingly for some considerable time. And we were in the middle, Welfare of the Young, that is, was in the middle of a terrific program we were running for the Northland Secondary College, a leadership program, which was going extremely well, except 100 participants, except we lost one. This unfortunate young lady became pregnant and couldn't continue. So we went on with 99, and we were getting to the stage where we just needed that little bit of extra money from the board to go ahead and complete the program, which had been very successful. At that stage, all committees got a letter from the board saying the board was unable to finance any programs in that year. So if committees wanted to go ahead, they had to find their own finances. So I don't know what other committees did, but desperate to try and keep our program going well, I got hold of a booklet that listed out all of those organisations that donated to charitable causes. And I went through all of that and wrote to them, met with them, did whatever was necessary to try and encourage them to help us to do what we had done so well up until that point. It was getting fairly desperate though. I'd gone through most of them when I ended up arranging a meeting with the trustees of the Peter Mackay bequest. And so I went and talked to them, and they listened very politely and said, we'll get back to you in a day or two. And they did, with a cheque, which was more than we needed for the Northland Secondary College program. And it gave us a little bit of extra money to do some of the things that we needed to do. That was followed year upon year with cheque after cheque after cheque. And they have given us an enormous amount of money over the years, thousands and thousands of dollars, which has enabled the welfare of the young to do all sorts of fabulous things, which we would never have been able to do had we not received all of this money from the Peter Mackay bequest. That continues on today. And so it's enabled us to do a wide range of things that the board and the finances of the club would never have been able to finance. We are eternally grateful to them, and it has made the work of the welfare of the young much more possible than it might otherwise have been. I think that's enough from me. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, Ken. And to say that Ken's effort in actually making sure the club was in a position to take advantage of that bequest was huge. And for that, Ken, we say an enormous thank you. And now I have an apology to make, as is often the case. I'm a bit of a problem sometimes following the running sheet. You don't have to go far now, Sue will tell you all about that. I overlooked another guest of Trevor Nink, Julie Dunmore. It's so nice to have you here, Julie, and please make Julie welcome. Thank you. You're very forgiving. Okay, so I now have another delightful task to perform, and Joe, you're just nearby, you're close enough at this stage. A critical event occurred in early March that was on us before we were really able to respond to it appropriately. What was that event? It was actually the 15th anniversary of Joe Mavros becoming CEO of this club. And so it gives me great pleasure today to present to Joe a special certificate of recognition and thanks, together with a compendium of tributes that have been created by past President Robert Fisher enormously skillfully from 10 of our 15 current past presidents that have served with Joe over that time, and that she's so worked with and supported so effectively. So you're going to have some pretty interesting reading, Joe, and I'm hoping the club will as an appendage to the bulletin next week. So let me read the citation. It's not that long, and I think the club deserves to hear it. During 15 years of exemplary service, Joe Mavros has regularly gone above and beyond the call of duty in her work for the club, epitomising the Rotary motto of service above self. Her wisdom, thoroughness, and dedication has served 15 presidents over 15 years, and in truth has left many of them reflecting on how they might have survived their year of club leadership without her. A joy for all to work with. Jo is always calm, composed, especially when things are changing and moving fast. Jo makes members and guests feel welcome and special and provides wonderful service and support at the individual level. She's as passionate about Rotary, I think, as any of us members that she serves might claim we are. No challenge is too large for Jo, as she demonstrated so effectively in helping Rotary Melbourne pivot to the online meeting format that became our mainstay through the 2 years of COVID restrictions. On behalf of all Rotary Melbourne members, we commend Jo for her exceptional service to the club. And we note that the accompanying compendium of tributes from myself, Honorary Secretary Russell Board, and 10 past presidents richly elaborates on this citation. And finally, I'm also delighted to, and you better come forward, Jo. I'm also delighted to present to you a dining, no, somewhat more impactful than that, I think, a dining experience that I think might transmit to you the warmth of feeling there is when you enjoy that experience, Jo. So let's just take the citation. There we are. Okay. Very nicely packaged. It's jolly good. The jolly good fellow, for she's a jolly good thing. So say all of us. Hey, let's not steal Jo's speaking time.
Yeah. Thanks, Ross. Thank you. Just briefly, when I started here in 2007, Chris knows what it's like not to have an office manager, because he was just finishing off his year as president. And we were in a dusty office in 12 Collins Street. Had to clean it before I started because we hadn't had anyone there for a while. But when I did look for work at that point, I was looking for something where I could give back a little bit too. And I think I found exactly what I was looking for, because being a full-time worker, and I had a young family at the time, believe it or not, there was no other opportunity, and Rotary just gave me that opportunity and the flexibility to work around my family. And it's been an honour working with the, 14, 15 presidents and maybe 10 or so secretaries, or no, maybe not that many. The treasurers, but nearly all of them. The new one's coming in soon, so he'll survive. So I think it's a credit to you all that you are willing to join somewhere where you want to serve, and I'm happy to help you serve the community. So well done to you.
Thanks very much, Jo. I think you can feel the love in the air. Now, it's now just notice time, and a couple of things I want to move through reasonably quickly. I'm getting the wind-up call here. The first thing is member news, and I think everyone's aware Bev Brock had some serious surgery a couple of weeks ago, and she had a pretty rough trot in the initial recovery period. But the good news is that she's now well and truly on the mend. She's consuming food. She's disconnected from all of the devices that they hook you up with in hospital for major surgery, and is looking like destined to go home in a day or two. So I think you'll all join me in keeping Bev first and foremost in our thoughts and prayers. Also, I'd just like to announce today that it's Jin Ling's birthday, and as well as Tillman Ruff and Prabal Soanes. We wish them all happy birthday. Can I just, a theme we just mention a little bit every week. The vibrancy of this club is in its membership, and you remember the presidential challenge that, you know, member get member. Let's see what we can do to find friends and relatives and others who might be interested in joining the club to be part of the amazing tradition that this club has created in serving the community. Any contacts or leads, please feel free to give Christina Boy a call or pass them on via email, and she'll do the heavy lifting to get that person signed up. I'm now going to join the raffle, and I might just ask MC Bernie McIntosh to come up and help me with that. Right. Thank you. Okay, it's a blue ticket and it's C25. And before I'm going to be one more minute, I'm just going to ask Barb Euronders to say a few words. And Barb, I've got you out of order, but if you'd like to give us a bit of an update on the Arts Walk. Thank you, Barbara. And I think Barb will come in on the screen almost instantly.
Thank you, Reg. And sorry, I'm not joining you at lunch today. It's the COVID situation has hit my office, so I'm here on my own and can't leave. So a team of 6 is all 4 of them are down. So I'm just on the screen today to let you all, remind you all that we've got our annual architecture walk this week on Friday. We did miss last year, so unfortunately with a number of reasons, and the previous year we actually did it online. So this year we're managing to get out there and take a walk again. We're meeting up at the M Pavilion, which is in the Queen Victoria Gardens opposite the Arts Centre on St Kilda Road at 5:30 on Friday. Spending a little bit of time around the Queen Victoria Gardens, then taking a stroll up to the shrine. And from there, we are then going to a Greek restaurant in Moonee Ponds called Phil Helene's, which is a Greek restaurant based on Cretan cuisine. And that's got a link back to the memorial that we have there that celebrates the Hellenic War Memorial, which celebrates the Anzacs in Crete during the Second World War. So I would love you, we've got a couple of places left. We do have to close the bookings today. So if you can get a chance to get online and book, and if you can't, give me a call and join us. It's always a good time, and lots of information and a good evening for all. So 5:30 on Friday, and followed by dinner. Thank you, Reg.
Thanks so much, Barbara. And be there or be square, folks. This is a not to miss event, and Barb always does an amazing job. Okay, I'd now like to call on Chairman Bernie McIntosh to introduce our guest speaker. Thanks, Bernie.
Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome Emma Germano to be our guest speaker today. Emma is the Managing Director of her family mixed operation called I Love Farms, growing fresh vegetables for local and export markets, as well as running sheep and beef cattle. I Love Farms has a firm focus on sustainability and strives to connect with Australian consumers. Emma is the current Victorian Farmers Federation President and was voted into that role in December 2020. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Emma Germano.
Always have to lower the microphone. I've got my phone here because I type myself some messages, which I probably won't look at. And also I could have you here until late into the evening if you let me talk. So start waving when it's getting time. But what I will do is I'll allow plenty of time for questions, because I think that that's generally the most interesting time when you have a guest speaker, that you get to hear about the things that you're actually interested in. So yes, I am the current Victorian Farmers Federation president and come off my family farm. And on the way in, I met with some gentlemen who were on their way up to this event, and they said, oh, who's the speaker today? And I said, oh, that's me. Oh, what are you, and where do you come from? And I said, oh, I'm a farmer and I'm the Farmers Federation president. And they said, well, you don't look like a farmer. And I said, well, that's probably thankful, because I assume that what you think a farmer looks like is a 57-year-old man in a flannelette shirt. So I'm glad I don't look like that. The topic that I was asked to speak to was agriculture and rural and regional Victoria post-pandemic. And firstly, I don't know if we are post-pandemic. I think we're still probably in the thick of it. And the implications that the pandemic has had on our country and our lifestyle. I think we're not going back to the way that it was before a pandemic, and we're all thinking about what does the new way of life look like for us all, not just here in Australia, but of course globally. Yesterday I was scrolling through Facebook, and a memory popped up from 2 years ago, and it was me on Channel 7, and the moral of the story that I was talking about was calm your farm. It was during the time where there was all of the panic buying occurring, and we were seeing the supermarket shelves starting to empty out. And as farmers, we were saying, we've got plenty of food on our farms, don't worry. It's actually the panic, and it's the demand on the product that's actually causing those shortages, and everybody just chill out. We've got plenty of food here in Australia. Not only do we produce enough to feed ourselves, but we produce enough to feed about another 40 million people abroad. So we've got this, farmers are resilient. We've gone through droughts, bushfires, floods. Now we're in a pandemic. We're a resilient bunch, and we'll be okay. And reflecting on that, I think sometimes farmers and the agriculture industry, our success is actually the biggest threat to us right now when we look at the world that we're in, with the amount of global disruption, the geopolitical disruption, and of course the pandemic in and of itself. And I think that we can't now calm our farms. As an Australian community and society, we really need to be thinking about our resilience, because the world is changing and we need to make sure that we're changing with it. My family migrated from Italy on both sides. My dad's dad migrated just prior to World War II, and his wife, he left her there pregnant, and she didn't get to meet back up with her husband here, or my grandmother didn't get to meet up with my grandfather until 10 years later, and then subsequently they purchased the land that we're on now. We have a familial, I guess, memory in our family of what it feels like to be hungry. So back in Sicily, in the old country, they were literally at the point where they had to share 6 or 7 potatoes amongst themselves, and to feed a couple of children and 4 or 5 adults. And it was getting to the point where they really had nothing. They had a piece of land that there was a very small amount of debt over, and my grandfather was saying to his mother, we should sell a portion of the land so that we can pay back that debt. But there was a real emotional connection to that land, and his mother really refused to want to sell any part of it. And before long, interest rates, I suppose, at the time skyrocketed, the world changed, the war broke out, all of those things were happening. And they very soon lost all of the land. The value of the land wasn't able to actually pay back that small amount of debt, relatively at the time. So we have a memory of that. So we came here hungry, and I'm talking on behalf of my family, we came here hungry with, just the bags, the clothes they had on their back, and they worked really, really hard. And despite the fact that they were very successful farmers and had, acquired land, they bought out other members of their town to work with them, and then subsequently help them to also buy land. The memory of being hungry was one that was never lost. And my grandmother literally used the same kettle, the pot, the cast iron pot, her entire life, refused to move over to the electronic kettle, and because of that memory. But that's not really the experience of the rest of Australia. So everybody, everybody doesn't remember that at a point in time in World War II that fuel was rationed and that agriculture was able to continue on using that fuel, but it was rationed. And now we can see that there's a level of hysteria and panic happening as we see fuel prices starting to skyrocket because of the current conflict overseas. And I think about it, we start talking about should we remove the excise tax? That's a conversation that started. And I think that's a really interesting conversation because there's a lot of people who could potentially be thinking about things like, how are we going with our infrastructure in regards to public transport? Should we be carpooling? Went into the VFF office 3 days ago and I was so cold because there's no such thing as having a window open anymore. We just run the air conditioning, round the clock and heating round the clock and lights on round the clock. And I just thought, isn't that interesting? We're talking about removing the excise, but should we actually think about doubling the tax on fuel? And I know everybody will go, no, don't do that. You're going to get us to a fuel price of $3.50 a litre or something. But I do think that we have a real significant challenge that we've become so accustomed to our lifestyle here in Australia. When we're talking about the ideology of climate change and we're going to phase out, coal-fired power stations and we're going to have all of these renewables, but we haven't really been thinking about that in the context of real risk and real threat to things like fuel security, input security, manufacturing security, and most importantly, food security. We've been, as a Farmers Federation, talking to people who are saying things like, oh, we don't want to drink dairy milk anymore because we're really concerned about animal welfare. And we've heard that it does, terrible things to the climate. So we all want to drink oat milk or we want to drink soy milk. And I guess what my job is to talk to consumers and the community about the trade-offs that we have to make as farmers all of the time. And the conversations that we're having, and I was having this conversation around the table, are really ideological conversations for the last probably 2 decades when it comes to food and how it's produced, how it's grown and raised. It's never from the perspective of what would happen if Australia didn't have enough food. And of course, what we know is, despite the fact that, we're talking about how we're going to feed 9 or 10 billion people by the year 2050, and we've got to be more efficient, we've got to be more innovative, and we've got to produce more with less. There are already people around the globe who don't have food. So food security is very real, not just for people, in third world countries that we might think of, but here in Australia, something like 2 million Australians don't have food security every single day. So I think that, and I don't want to talk for hours, but what does the post-pandemic world look like? Well, I think the post-pandemic world is looking like we've got some different challenges here in Australia now. We have to think about that resilience from a food security perspective. And it's really difficult because, I could say things as the president of the Farmers Federation, like, don't bite the hand that feeds you when you put all of this red tape on farmers, and we could be defensive about it. But we've actually had to get to the point where we understand that the community wants to understand how things are done, that they want us to be producing our food ethically. But we might be shifting that conversation now as to, do we actually have genuine food security in Australia? And of course, going back to the notion of, we produce enough for 60 million, that changes very quickly when the majority of our fertilisers that we use to grow our crops are purchased in from China and other places, that the fuel that we need in order to get our products to market and, drive our tractors and our headers and our irrigation motors, that fuel, our strategic reserve of Australian fuel is actually located in the US and would take us 3 or 4 weeks to actually get to Australia. That the packaging that we put our food in also comes from overseas, and that we also have no workers and no labour, as we've seen, particularly the downward trend in migration into Australia, that we are reliant upon migrant workers to keep our abattoirs operating, to keep our fruit and vegetables picked, and all sorts of other jobs. So I think Australia is in a very, very interesting position right now. And we were also talking about the political cycles. We've got a 3-year federal political cycle and a 4-year state political cycle. And it seems to me that not only do politicians not think about the entirety of that 3 or 4 year term, but they're certainly not thinking 20, 50 and 100 years ahead like other nations are. Other nations like China, other nations in the Middle East who have 100-year food security plans. We've been so lucky that we've become quite complacent. So I think that there's a new challenge in regards to how we think about resilience in Australia post-pandemic, and certainly in the new world that we're all entering into. And it is a real challenge. And listening to your proceedings and thinking about the similarities of your membership organisation to my membership organisation, and that one of the things that we really have to be focused on is ensuring that we have the next generation coming through who are not apathetic to the things that we're thinking about and talking about, and thinking about how young people in the next generation also create influence, because it's often outside organisations like your organisation and like my organisation. So I did have a whole bunch of things here, you know, input security, supply chain security, affordability of housing out in the regions, decentralisation. We had a conversation about, you know, two Victorias. There's Metro Victoria and then there's Regional Victoria, and are they aligned and working together? Are we seeing the government investing into the regions the way that we need to see them invest into the regions? And are the governments, both state and federal, actually investing in resilience and building people in the communities that they are or that they come from, in order to be able to protect and take care of themselves when things go wrong? We've just seen Queensland and New South Wales underwater. There's a potential it's going to happen again over the next few days. This happened 3 years ago. We had the Black Saturday bushfires, you know, 10, 12, 15 years ago. We had a repeat of that in 2020. And yet I don't see the progress around that community resilience that we need to face these new challenges. And as much as I don't want to be an alarmist, I do think we actually have to think about that geopolitical security threat that we have. And that really starts with our ability to feed ourselves and for communities to be able to take care of themselves. What does that look like for our organisation? It looks like, how do we do engagement, and how do we pass messages through the community and have everybody advocating for those things that we know are necessary in the place that they are from, and equipping the community to understand these issues differently. So farmers are becoming such a small number, you know, in regards to the population, that it's very difficult for us to create political influence. It's absolutely tantamount for us as an industry to actually be connecting with consumers and creating an understanding of why food security is really important, because ultimately it's the community that have to be doing that lobbying on our behalf by understanding what we need as a community. So I will leave room for questions, because I'm very aware of the time. And I'm sorry, because that wasn't exactly the world's most positive view of what's happening in the agriculture industry. I guess some of the positive stuff is that we've had wonderful commodity prices across meat and grains. That's led to really massive prices of land, which has both its benefits and its drawbacks. And we've got to be thinking not just about that next generation and how they engage and how they be resilient on behalf of Victoria and Australia, but also how we get them to continue to produce food in this country. Because I think that though we might be so far removed, and maybe that cycle's coming back around to create that awareness, we just simply haven't thought about going back onto farms, or, you know, being a food producer as being a particularly sexy career to have over the last, you know, couple of decades, but that's certainly starting to change now. So I think as from my organisation and your organisation, we have similar challenges, but ultimately we're all asking ourselves the question, how do we best serve the community, particularly in times that are changing so drastically? So I'll leave you just with those thoughts.
I can see a few hands raised already. Emma has kindly volunteered to take some questions. We've got a few minutes for questions, so if you can please announce your name clearly and wait for the microphone to come to you.
Sue McCarthy. And do you have any knowledge, not better, of how much of Australia's agricultural land is owned by foreigners and foreign corporations? And what is that likely to do to our food security in the future?
Great question. What we know is that 97% of Australian farms are still owned and operated by Australian family farmers. But there is no question, it was one of the things that I'd text myself about foreign investment. It's a real challenge. I think we've seen a failure of diplomacy, really. And I don't know that that's necessarily, I'm not blaming the government for that failure of diplomacy, but when we think about China particularly, what we've seen is over the last 20 years is this inflation of prices of a product when it gets to China. So we've got, let's say, cherry producers in Australia who think that it's absolutely, there's no question that cherries are worth $30 a kilo, but China's been the only country that's been willing to pay that amount. And that's been in order to keep markets like Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, other markets, us supplying them instead of us supplying other markets. And as we've seen, they've now, crashed the price of things like lobster and barley and whatever by saying that they're not going to take it anymore. And we've got this reverse problem when it comes to foreign investment. So I think what we are starting to hear, the sentiments are starting to be that there will be less foreign investment allowed from countries like China due to the national interest. And it's interesting because we're looking at superannuation companies and wealth investment firms who have been asked to pull out of Russia where they had money invested. And our challenge as an agriculture industry is, why do we have Australian superannuation funds going to other places to invest when they could be investing in Australian land, agricultural businesses, and indeed things like, we've got Canadian super funds that have bought up huge parcels of water or huge amounts of water out of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So I think it's a great point that you raise. There is an awareness of how much of that has occurred and is occurring, and the graph's starting to come back down, and I think we're starting to understand the implications to sovereignty of that foreign investment. But likewise, we also need to be able to have that investment into the agriculture industry. So it's a key critical question that you've asked. We need the investment so that we can continue to grow and innovate, but we need to be very careful about where we get that investment from, because sometimes it's counter our interest.
Thanks, Emma. Daswin here. You mentioned that one of the challenges we have is overseas fertilizer and the packaging and all those things. What kind of options have we proposed to the government and all to change that?
Oh, geez, everything's connected to everything else. So I think one of the real challenges here, and I don't mean to be disparaging, is the labour cost. The cost of wages has actually put us into a position where manufacturing is very, very difficult in Australia. We have been, as part of the federal election campaign, we're talking about needing to bring manufacturing back onshore of key inputs. And the other thing that we've also been asking for is for a food security map and a real understanding. We've got a federal government that actually didn't understand what things were sitting at the port, how many things come in and how many things go out. There isn't a coordinated overarching plan in Australia that looks at that from a food security perspective. And we've also been calling on the federal government to think about it through the defence lens. So, ensuring that we've got the Prime Minister's office now has the security or supply chain security as an office within the PMO. But we need to be seriously focused on that. And I think we need to speed it up. It can't be something that takes 5-10 years. And we do see this inertia in government. We get an inquiry after a report, after a royal commission, after this, and how many reports are sitting there on shelves where the recommendations have never been adopted. So we've got to get out of this mentality of just writing another report. And unfortunately, sometimes, the burning platform, you won't jump off until you've got no more platform left to stand on. And I think that, unfortunately, Australia has sleepwalked its way into a situation where we are lacking resilience around natural disasters, around things like food security, and around this geopolitical tension that we're seeing.
Staying with the theme of land use, I guess I'm aware, I've read a little bit about the 30 by 30 movement, which is trying to preserve 30% of the world's land and sea by the year 2030. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the competing pressures for land. Obviously, growing food is a high priority, but there's lots of other people that are putting dibs on land. Absolutely. And it's another great question, because once again, we have failed to take a strategic lens to how much of this land needs to be looked after for food. And ultimately, we acknowledge that the traditional owners of the land that we're on, and the traditional owners of the land that my farm is on, are the Gunai-Kurnai people. And we look out here and we talk about the Yarra River and that this is where we're standing, or where this high-rise building has been built, is on prime agricultural land, and we continue to build houses on prime agricultural land. And now we're starting to build renewable energy facilities on prime agricultural land and putting transmission lines through prime agricultural land. One of our challenges as an organisation is just getting people to understand, whether it's companies that are coming to do renewable developments or transmission lines, or the government itself, that
it is not vacant land when it's a farm. And you can talk about wanting to reduce things like energy prices and that's really important. And I understand why for the community that is really important. But there is no consideration taken into account of once we remove all of the potatoes that are grown in Ballarat for the Western Transmission Line, do the cost of potatoes go up? And that's not factored in to the calculations that are made or the primary objective of the renewables coming online and the transmission lines in the first instance. So once again, I think because we haven't been hungry, we don't have that corporate memory of hunger, that we are just taking it for granted. So once again, our challenge is to continually say, this is not vacant land, and food security means national security, and that we continually have to think about that. And what we're calling on the Victorian state government through an election commitment is that we would strategically look at the land in Victoria, and instead of the Victorian Farmers Federation arguing transmission line by transmission line as they pop up, that we would have a strategic overlay that is 30, 40, 50 years into the future, because that enables us to buy up that land instead of forcing farmers off it. It stops us from cutting through agricultural businesses. In some cases, you see transmission lines and they rock up to a property and say, here, you got to sign this license agreement and we're going to cut through your property, which would, in some instances, remove 50% of that productivity off that land purely because where the line has to go. So we're calling on the state government to ensure that there is a strategic plan around how we're going to do electricity transmission and indeed gas pipelines and things like that over a longer period of time. But again, that strategic lens hasn't been placed on anything, and it's just, you know, small decision after small decision that's being made without any holistic view of as to the impact that it has on agricultural land and arable land in general.
Queen Scalza, good afternoon. Great to see you here. The shortage of labour is a real big issue for us. We've got a very large land holding up there in Mildura. Lots of discussions, lots of feeble attempts with visas. What do you think the best approach is to get the labour force that we need to assist agriculture?
So I was one of the very first people, and in fact, that's how I got involved in the Farmers Federation and in agricultural advocacy, because I could just never get workers to come and pick cauliflower and broccoli on my farm. And we used the traditional model of, you know, the Asian contractors who would come out with a bus of workers. Without sounding rude or disrespectful, we've gotten to a point of such virtue signalling now that there is all of this. You know, we talk about exploitation. There's all of this stuff about there's so much exploitation and migrant workers are particularly vulnerable and therefore we shouldn't have any. We are in this challenging position to have to say, if you don't bring the migrant workers in to work in the fields, you actually lose Australian jobs up the supply chain. It's become very, very challenging because of the unions and their voices in this particular space. But we absolutely believe we need to have an agriculture visa that is specifically dedicated to agriculture and deals with the vulnerabilities of migrant workers. When we've got a 3% unemployment rate in this country, to think Australians are going to fill those jobs is just fanciful. And to the point about the rich being able to afford their ideology of, you know, practically it just doesn't work out. Challenge with that, of course, being that we've had a Liberal or a coalition government who have been very mindful of taking workers out of the Pacific because of the geopolitical tensions and not wanting to see China create military bases there. So there's so many factors that contribute, but we're just on the cusp of Indonesia agreeing to come on board the agriculture visa, and hopefully that will create some momentum. But there is no question that not only do we need workers in agriculture, but all of the services to agriculture also need workers. And of course, we're in competition with lots of other sectors. We don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough anything for this country to grow. And my disappointment with the coalition government over the last period of time that they've been in government is that we've seen no major reform. So I think that we need major immigration reform in this country. We need to start from scratch. When our borders were closed was the best time for us to take stock of who was here and who we needed to have here and the skills gaps and shortages. And we also need complete industrial relations reform, because it's gotten to the point now where I, as a farmer, have to pay $35, $36 an hour to get people to pick cauliflower and broccoli on my farm, and have got to get into the position to be able to afford to pay them that amount by insisting that the supermarkets sell my product for the right price and pay me the right price for that. So we collectively, and not just the agriculture industry, but all the other industries have to continually put this pressure on for that real reform as we're facing such different times than what we were, 20 years ago.
Thank you, Emma. David here. I hope this question encompasses practically everything that's been talked about, but given the proud tradition of Italian families making best use of their blocks of land, their home gardens, veggie gardens, vines, etc., berries, and given the preponderance of rural slums, as I call them, houses built right up to the boundary, and the ignorance of many younger people in how to grow their own, do you as a professional have any advice for how Australia can become more resilient on the very micro local level?
I think that all resilience has to be considered from the perspective of micro level, because ultimately when there is a fire in a community, it's that community that puts the fire out. So I think that we need to firstly think about community-based leadership and ensuring that the communities have the tools that they need to firstly raise up local leaders. We have to have an understanding of what leadership means. It's not just an official role like what I have. That's not, we've got to think about raising up leaders in the place that they're from. We need to start really young. We've got to make sure that young school kids are thinking about these things and have an awareness of where their food comes from, how it's grown, how it's raised. Because I tell you, the easiest way to stop consumers complaining about how things are grown are to ask them to grow it themselves, particularly something like a cauliflower. Like people will say to me, I couldn't even get the head of the cauliflower. I got all these leaves, but I got no head. Why is that? And that's when people start to understand. So making sure that we do that from a young age. And this is very contentious of me to say this, but I do think that there should be some kind of, there's a lot of countries that do compulsory national service. And I think that we actually have to start thinking about compulsory national service. And that doesn't necessarily mean military-based thinking, but it means every single person should be able to step in when we've got a global pandemic, that we don't have a shortage of nurses in our hospitals because there's no other people in the community that can stick a swab up somebody's nose. That to me is absolutely ridiculous. So we have to have people who are diverse in their skills. Every Australian should be ready to serve Australia in some way. And that we have to, there is no question we have to have a framework around that, because just waiting for it to happen, again, we will sleepwalk into particular disasters that we could be facing. And when we're seeing these floods happening and the Prime Minister comes out and says, well, the Defence Force can't be turned on in a dime. It's like, pardon me? Like, what happens if something really serious goes down and you're telling us that the Defence Force can't be turned on in a dime? We should, as a community, be able to turn around tomorrow and fight that bushfire, manage those people that are on roofs because they're trying to escape a flood, manage pandemics and how we go about the healthcare system. We all have to be part of this solution, and we need frameworks put in place by the government to encourage that. Thank you.
Well, that speech lacked passion, didn't it?
I knew I was on a short time frame, so I can talk real quick.
Emma, it's been our delight to have such a passionate person along to speak with us and share your thoughts today. And I'd like you all collectively to thank Emma for joining us today. We've also got a special, it's a bit like the World of Sport pack, but within there, perhaps the most special thing is our R100 socks, which are a special gift made by one of our members. Thank you, Emma, for joining us, and we wish you all the best in your role at the Victorian Farmers Federation. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. It's lovely to see people here in person, and also thank you to the people on Zoom joining us. It's also special to have you. Thanks to our MC, Richard Dent, Thanksgiver, Philip Cornish, and our lunch setup and reception teams for their efforts in making all this happen. Please, if you can stay behind, if any of you can stay behind and help those people to bring things down, that would be very much appreciated. A reminder that next week is our guest speaker, Trevor Jensen, who is the Civil Aviation Consultant, former Head of Operations at Ansett, speaking on the future of aviation. We hope you can join us and perhaps invite a colleague or a friend along. Please stand to close the meeting with the National Anthem presented by David Cram. Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free, with golden soil and wealth for two. Our home is girt by sea, our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare.